This episode of The History Guy is brought to you by Incogni. There was some startling news from the nation's capital this year as the National Park Service announced that they would be removing 158 of the famous cherry trees, including the sentimentally loved tree named Stumpy, from the Washington D.C. tidal basin as part of a $113 million seawall renewal project. And while those trees will eventually be replaced with cuttings from the very same trees, the mulching of 158 of these trees brings to mind that time, 112 years ago today, when the first 2 cherry trees were planted in the District of Columbia. Those cherry trees are often represented as a symbol of friendship between the United States and Japan, but the situation was actually rather more complex than that. In fact, the trees arrived at a time when many people on both sides of the Pacific were convinced that war between the United States and Japan was inevitable. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Now imagine that I am one of thousands of data pirates, shady companies that are collecting, aggregating, and trading your personal data like your phone number or your shopping habits without you knowing anything about it. But like all pirates, I be hunted, and that's because the law says that ye have the right to demand that we data pirates delete your information and protect your personal privacy. But I am not afraid, because I know that if you were to try to do that yourself, it would take ye years. But avast, my foul piratical plans are foiled by Incogni. Because while you go about your business, Incogni can do all that messy work for you. Incogni helps you protect your privacy and take your personal data off the market by reaching out to the scurvy data brokers on your behalf, requesting your personal data removal and dealing with their objections. I signed up with Incogni last September. It only took me a few minutes to sign up, and since then, they've managed to get my personal data removed from more than 130 sites that were selling my private information just like pirate booty. And I didn't have to do anything. In fact, they sent me regular updates on their progress. Try it, and I swear you will quickly see a reduction in those nuisance emails and those annoying targeted ads. So go to incogni.com/thehistoryguy and use the code TheHistoryGuy to get your exclusive offer of 60% off an annual plan. That's incogni.com/thehistoryguy using the code TheHistoryGuy, or click the link down below and have your personal data taken off the market. According to the National Park Service, the Washington D.C. Memorial Mall and Memorial Parks include some 3,800 cherry trees. Now, on face, this might not be a surprise. The black cherry tree is native to the D.C. area and, in fact, across the eastern United States into Canada and Mexico. And, of course, a cherry tree figures prominently in the legends surrounding the nation's first president. So the story goes 6-year-old George Washington was given a hatchet as a birthday present and, playing with it, chopped into his father's favorite cherry tree. When asked what happened by his father, he responded, "I can't tell a lie, Pa. You know I can't tell a lie. I did cut it with my hatchet." The story today is generally thought to be apocryphal, considered little more than a colorful fabrication of an early Washington biographer, although, as the National Park Service notes, the story is not so easily disproven. That is to say that, while there's no apparent credible evidence that it did happen, we don't know for sure that it didn't. But we do know that in the biography in which the story first appeared, written by Reverend Mason Weems, the tree was described as a beautiful young English cherry tree. But the trees that line the National Mall, attracting some 1.5 million visitors each year during peak blossom in late March or early April, are neither the native black cherry nor the imported English sweet cherry, but are several species of cherry tree that come from Japan. The online guide to Japan writes that the Japanese cultural tradition of hanami, or flower viewing, dates back as far as 1,000 years. The website of the Japanese National Tourism Organization explains that cherry blossoms, known in Japan as sakura, are well known around the world for their radiant, delicate, and transient beauty. However, they are more than simply beautiful trees, as sakura have strong ties to Japan's history, culture, and identity. Originally used to divine the year's harvest, sakura came to embody wabi-sabi philosophy and Shinto ideas of impermanence, hope, and renewal, and are now one of Japan's most iconic natural symbols. The festival and beauty of the flowering trees was noticed by American visitors, including botanist David Fairchild. Edwin Grosvenor, editor of American Heritage magazine, wrote in 2023 that few people have impacted as many lives as did David Fairchild, Working for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, he and his staff are said to have introduced more than 100,000 plant species and varieties into the United States, including soybeans, mangoes, avocados, dates, alfalfa, nectarines, pistachios, horseradish, bamboo, kiwi fruit, and durum wheat. After a visit to Japan in 1902, he wrote of the cherry trees, "I could not fail to catch their spirit, and I realized that here was something so remarkable that it deserved to be studied by my countrymen and introduced into the United States, if possible." In 1906, he imported and began cultivating trees on land near Chevy Chase, Maryland. And despite the fact he wrote that doubt of their hardiness had been expressed by so many horticultural experts, the trees thrived. Fairchild became an advocate of planting trees in the District of Columbia, giving a speech on Arbor Day, 1908. In attendance, the National Park Service writes, was Mrs. Eliza Skidmore, described by the Park Service as a world traveler, writer, and diplomat at a time when such norms kept many women at home. Skidmore had visited Japan in 1885, and like Fairchild had been enthralled by the beauty of the cherry blossoms. She had, the Park Service writes, been trying to convince the U.S. Army Superintendent of the Office of Public Buildings and Grounds to plant cherry trees in the Washington, D.C. area for 24 years without success, complaining, according to Grosvenor, that her requests were of no avail, no matter how fervent, long or often repeated to successive indifferent and obdurate superintendents. But Fairchild's speech offered an opportunity. Grosvenor writes, now she had an ally in Fairchild, the well-connected botanist in the agricultural department with wide experience in growing newly introduced plants. Skidmore and Fairchild collaborated on a plan to raise donations to buy 100 trees a year for 10 years to place in Potomac Park. She would soon find a powerful ally in her cause. According to the National Park Service, as a matter of course, Mrs. Skidmore sent a note outlining her plan to the new First Lady, Helen Herron Taft. While her letter to the new First Lady might have been simply a matter of course, it produced a notable response. Grosvenor writes, 2 days after sending her note, Skidmore received a positive response from the First Lady. Not only did Mrs. Taft like the idea, she immediately made arrangements to acquire some cherry trees for Potomac Park. The First Lady had visited Japan when her husband was Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of War and had experienced the beauty of those blossoms firsthand. The response, however, was intimately tied to an underlying issue. The Office of the Historian of the United States State Department writes, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the relationship between the United States and Japan was marked by increasing tension and corresponding attempts to use diplomacy to reduce the threat of conflict. Each side had territory and interest in Asia that they were concerned the other might threaten. That was evident in the visit that Mrs. Taft had made in 1905. The visit between Taft, the U.S. Secretary of War who was presumably being groomed to succeed Roosevelt in the Oval Office, which included a congressional delegation and Roosevelt's popular daughter, Alice, was billed as a goodwill visit. But there was another agenda. The Council on Foreign Relations writes that Japan's naval prowess and reach now threatened not just Russia, but potentially also the United States. Looking to head off the threat, Roosevelt dispatched the Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, to Tokyo. So while his wife was appreciating the cherry blossoms, her husband was secretly concluding an agreement to prevent war with Japan. The agreement avoided conflict by Japan agreeing to support U.S. control of the Philippines in exchange for the U.S. agreeing to let Japan oversee Korea. The Taft-Katsura Agreement was kept secret, even to Congress. It was not revealed until some 20 years later, and the cherry trees would themselves become a part of the ongoing diplomacy. When Mrs. Taft's plans to purchase cherry trees became public, a prominent Japanese-American, chemist and businessman Dr. Jokichi Takamine, an advocate of U.S.-Japan goodwill, sought to, instead of the U.S. Department of Parks purchasing the trees, instead have them donated by Japan. In his 2020 book, The Art of Peace, Dr. Stan Katz notes that the idea first passed via the U.S. Secretary of State, Philander Knox, through the Consul General of Japan in New York City, Koichi Mizuno, who was, Katz writes, pleased with this gift idea, but wished to first contact Japan's central government to decide how best to proceed. This is when Prince Iesato Takagawa was most likely brought into this significant diplomatic process. The title Prince was derived from the fact that he was heir to the Takagawa clan, which had ruled Japan as a shogunate until 1868. Takagawa was an important politician, president of the Diet, Japan's upper house of Congress. His involvement shows that the gift of cherry trees was more than just a goodwill gesture. However, the government of Japan decided that the best idea was to have the donation of the trees come directly from the people of the capital of Japan to the capital of the United States. Grosvenor writes, on August 30th, 1909, the Japanese embassy notified the State Department that the city of Tokyo, prompted by a desire to show its friendly sentiments towards its sister capital city of the United States, has decided to offer as a gift 2,000 young trees raised in Japan. The trees arrived in Washington, D.C. in January of 1910. However, the National Park Service writes, to everyone's dismay, an inspection team from the Department of Agriculture discovered that the trees were infested with insects and nematodes and were diseased. To protect American growers, the department concluded that the trees must be destroyed. Katz write that while all parties involved met the distressing news with determination and goodwill, in great likelihood, Prince Takagawa, upon hearing that the first Japanese gift shipment of cherry trees had not worked out, decided his presence in the United States would be helpful. Takagawa's visit in 1910 was his first diplomatic visit to the United States and came in conjunction with a delegation of 60 Japanese officials and businessmen, including Yukio Ozaki, the mayor of Tokyo. Clearly, the question of cherry trees was wrapped up in other concerns. In fact, tensions were rising. After Taft's visit in 1905, Theodore Roosevelt had helped negotiate an end to the Russo-Japanese War, role that had earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. But the agreement had not made everybody happy. Time magazine wrote in 1950, when Teddy Roosevelt decided it was high time to put an end to the Russo-Japanese War and intervened in 1905, indignant citizens of Tokyo poured into the streets and burned down buildings to show their displeasure with the peace terms. Yukio Ozaki, then mayor of Tokyo, felt differently. Grateful for the U.S. mediation, he sent a thank you gift of 2,000 Japanese cherry trees to the city of Washington in 1909. Other tensions were rising as well. Japan was pressing territorial disputes with China, an issue that the United States saw as a threat to their open-door trade policy in China, and Japanese officials were becoming frustrated with anti-Asian sentiment on the U.S. West Coast, an issue that had only grown since the Japanese victory in their war with Russia. While Mayor Ozaka, a pacifist seeking peace, arranged for a second shipment of cherry trees, Katz writes that wherever Tokugawa went, he was often bombarded by journalists probing questions such as, was war between Japan and America imminent and inevitable? It was a fair question. In 1907, another agreement had been required to keep the peace. The Office of the Historian of the United States State Department writes that in 1906, the San Francisco Board of Education enacted a measure to send Japanese and Chinese children to segregated schools. The government of Japan was outraged by the policy. In a series of notes exchanged between late 1907 and early 1908, known collectively as the Gentleman's Agreement, the U.S. government agreed to pressure the San Francisco authorities to withdraw the measure, and the Japanese government promised to restrict immigration of laborers to the United States. Another agreement regarding territorial disputes in Asia and the treatment of Japanese immigration to the United States was concluded between United States Secretary of State Ailu Root and Japanese ambassador to the United States Takahira Kagoro in 1908. The Office of the Historian writes, by reiterating each country's position in the region, the Root-Takahira Agreement served to lessen the threat of a misunderstanding or war between the two nations. This series of agreements still did not resolve all of the outstanding issues. U.S. treatment of Japanese residents continued to cause tension between the two nations. Amid these tensions, Ozaki arranged for another donation of trees. The National Park Service writes, the number of trees had now increased to 3,020. The scions from these trees were taken in December 1910 from the famous collection along the bank of the Arakawa River in the Adachi Ward, a suburb of Tokyo, and grafted onto specifically selected understock. The trees arrived in Washington, D.C. on March 26, 1912. The National Park Service writes that on March 27th, Helen Herron Taft and the Viscountess Chinda, wife of the Japanese ambassador, planted 2 Yoshino cherry trees on the northern bank of the tidal basin, about 125 feet south of what is now Independence Avenue, southwest. At the conclusion of the ceremony, the First Lady presented a bouquet of American Beauty roses to Viscountess Chinda. Washington, D.C.'s renowned National Cherry Blossom Festival grew from this simple ceremony, witnessed by just a few persons. These 2 original trees still stand several hundred yards west of the John Paul Jones Memorial, located at the terminus of 17th Street Southwest. Situated near the bases of the trees is a large bronze plaque which commemorates the occasion. The Washington, D.C. Evening Star wrote on the 31st, 3,000 trees, which should come to full bloom within 3 years, are being set out around the river border of the park along each side of the footways that wind along the waterfront, within range of the view of riders and vehicles along the roads. Grosvenor writes that Mrs. Yae Ozaki, the Tokyo mayor's wife, sent a letter to Mrs. Taft, characterizing the second shipment of trees as a memorial of national friendship between the United States and Japan. But how strong was that friendship? The editors of the New Orleans Times-Democrat opined the same month. Time and again, the Japanese people and even minor officials give evidence of pronounced ill will towards things American, which naturally causes the public here to receive with something more than suspicion the professions of friendship of the emperor and his government. The Helena, Montana Independent was more blunt. Military experts of all world powers, the paper wrote, predict that eventually the United States will have to fight Japan. Today, the cherry trees of Washington, D.C. are often presented as symbols of peace between the United States and Japan, but the truth is that the cherry tree diplomacy was really rather more part of a long process of simply trying to avoid war, a process that would eventually fail. As the Office of the Historian of the United States Department of State notes, despite many efforts to reach agreements on these points, by the early 1920s, the United States and Japan were again at odds. But perhaps the greatest irony was that the cherry blossoms came to signify the war that the gift of trees had hoped to prevent. History professor Emiko Onuki-Tierney wrote in her 2002 book Kamikaze, Cherry Blossoms and Nationalism, personnel were told it was an honor to die like beautiful falling cherry petals during the era of imperial expansion in Japan, which stretched from the 19th century through the World War II. Many cherry trees were planted during that period, and their image on Army and Navy insignias helped cement the association between Japan and the cherry blossoms. Today, the approximately 1.5 million visitors that come to see the cherry blossoms bloom in Washington, D.C. might simply appreciate the beauty of the flowers, or they might appreciate the symbolism that the short-lived flowers represent the transience of human life and the Buddhist principle that we should enjoy life while we can. Shoot, they might even enjoy them as the Library of Congress hopes as a symbol of the everlasting friendship between the people of the United States and Japan. But I think it's safe to say that few of those visitors truly understand the difficult diplomatic situation that brought the cherry trees to Washington. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.